Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H.
And I'm Isabel, class of 2023, today's student host.
And you're watching History in a Hoodie.
Today's episode is going to be about partitioning of Africa, where we will learn all about how Europeans screwed up the African continent. I can't wait to find out.
Well then, let's get the show started.
What are we learning about today?
The standard for today's lesson asks the students to explain how European partitioning across Africa contributed to conflict, civil war, and artificial political boundaries in Africa today.
Before we start, let's go over some of the vocabulary for today's lesson. Transatlantic slave trade means the exchange of captured African men and women to Europe and the Americas. Partitioning means the division of African continent into colonies controlled by the Europeans. The Berlin Conference was the meeting of European leaders to determine how to partition Africa. Genocide is the intentional murder of an entire ethnic group of people.
Europe first became interested in Africa due to trade with India and China. The valuable and rare goods that were found in the East Asian region were highly sought after in Europe, so trading with the area was in high demand. There were a couple of ways of getting to Asia: the short way, the longer way, or the desperate attempt to find another way on the opposite side of the globe. The short way was the land route from Europe to East Asia and back. Caravan traders ran across the Silk Road, crossing through countries and empires along the way. Each new land entered meant a pass-through tax and the chance of caravan raiders stealing some or all the bounty. The longer way was the sea route along the southern tip of Africa. While seafaring technology was advancing during the Age of Discovery, sailing ships were not going to successfully navigate the entire route around Africa and to India or China in one continuous voyage. So, countries like Portugal, Spain, Great Britain, and the Netherlands began to set up ports along the African coastline as pit stops for the trip. This is also the beginning of European explorers interacting with African people, taking African resources, and enslaving African people. The desperate attempt to find another way on the opposite side of the globe, by the way, were the expeditions by Cartier, Cabot, Hudson, and other explorers to find a northwest passage to shorten the trip to Asia. During the 1400s through the early 1900s, European nations were engaged in a race to colonize and conquer as many parts of the world as they could. Expanding their empires meant untold riches, glory for their monarchs, and the opportunity to spread their culture and religious beliefs to new people. This race meant that the European powers would butt heads frequently over who would control the claim to which piece of a continent. Great Britain, Spain, and France all wanted chunks of North America, which led to at least 4 wars between them. Spain and Portugal both claimed South America, and had to go to the Pope to get their dispute resolved. Dr. David Livingstone of Great Britain led the first major expedition of the interior of the African continent in the mid-1800s. He sent many letters back to Europe describing the wondrous geographical discoveries he made, including the source of the Nile and Victoria Falls, the richness of the resources of Africa, and his recommendations for setting up trading networks and religious missions throughout the continent. Livingstone's account inspired great interest in colonizing Africa by many European nations, a scramble for Africa as it was. But this time the European leaders would learn from their own history. In 1884, leaders from 14 European governments and representatives from the United States met in Berlin, Germany for the Berlin Conference. The purpose of this conference would be to discuss how Africa's land would be divided to prevent a war over Africa. Prior to this meeting, about 10% of Africa was already under European control, but by the end of the meeting, the European powers would claim ownership over nearly the entire continent, with Great Britain and France claiming the largest chunks. The final result of the Berlin Conference was that except for Ethiopia and Liberia, all of Africa came under control of European empires. Liberia maintained its independence at the insistence of the United States to serve as a possible homeland for freed slaves to return to shortly after the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War. Ethiopia, on the other hand, was claimed by Italy, but managed to fend off an Italian invasion and remained independent.
So what? How did partitioning create conflict, civil war, and artificial political boundaries in Africa today?
European influence in Africa was much like a plague. The slave trade notoriously destroyed entire communities of people. Logically, the slave traders were most interested in abducting the strongest of each community to transport overseas for hard labor, typically the young adults of the population, which often left behind communities of young children, the elderly, and the infirmed, a community structure where few can produce goods and services that could not survive very long. Slave traders also took advantage of intertribal conflicts already existing and bribed one group to sell out another, escalating conflicts to the breaking points in many Western and Southern Africa areas. There's no doubting this statement. During the 1800s, Europeans felt themselves superior to Africans. They felt their societal structure was superior. They felt their culture was superior. And they felt their religion was superior. Having learned about the African way of life from explorers, many Europeans began to feel it was, quote, white man's burden, end quote, to civilize Africa. Africans needed to be more like Europeans, dress like Europeans, eat like Europeans, and worship like Europeans. Many missionaries traveled to Africa to spread European religious belief and culture far and wide, and in the process taking away the unique and distinct cultures of hundreds of African groups that had been cultivated for centuries without outside influences. European explorers sought out raw materials for wealth back home, and often ran headlong into local tribes overtaking the resources. The Zulu nation in South Africa was conquered by the British over the riches in the ground of their land, and the Ashanti in modern Ghana also struggled as gold was found in their homeland. In modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo, then the Belgian Congo, King Leopold II of Belgium declared all resources and wealth of the colony belonged to himself, and utilized the locals as slave labor to pillage as much as he could, before his own government had put an end to his horrors. But on top of reaping their land of its wealth, reaping their communities of their strength, and replacing their culture with the European way of life, the Europeans made an even more lasting effect on the continent with the Berlin Conference. If you'll remember, 14 European nations and the US attended this meeting, and 0 African leaders were involved. Many of the lines drawn on the map at the conference are still in place today. So the problems in modern independent countries today are causally connected directly back to the actions at the Berlin Conference. What European leaders failed to consider was the people of Africa, because they were too involved in the fortunes Africa could provide. One line on a map could separate a tribal group from their ancestral homeland forever. Another line could combine 2 or more warring tribes together into one country. These artificial political boundaries are meaningless to the people of Africa until you consider that these boundaries translate into governments, power, control over resources and wealth, and usually result in some form of imbalance between the various groups placed within these borders. Let's look at the country of Sudan for an example. Sudan was controlled by the British until the 1940s, when the country was granted its independence. Within its borders lived 2 different ethnic groups, an Arabic group and a Bantu group, who do not get along well at all. When the British left Sudan, they left the country's government in control of the Arabic group. They also left behind quite a bit of military hardware, including tanks and helicopters, also in control of the Arabic group. Within the year after they gained independence, the Arabic president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, began attacking Bantu villages in the south of the country. Nearly 60 years of conflict in Sudan, what most people consider a genocide, was only resolved recently in 2013, when United Nations and international pressure resulted in the country being divided into 2 and led to the newly created nation, South Sudan. This scenario can be seen across Africa and in many parts of the world where European empires conquered to gain resources and trade markets and left the lands in much worse shape than how they found them.
Now what? What am I going to do with this information?
When I finalize my report cards each quarter of the school year, one part of the task is the conduct scores and comments. Contrary to popular student belief, I cannot write whatever I want on the report card for the comments, but there's a pre-created list of available comments for me to select from. You may have seen a comment before, like "pleasure to teach," show up on your report card. I've been asked before by some overachieving students which comment is the best one to receive. I'm sure this is different for several teachers. There are great comments like cooperative, great student, great leader, and outstanding. But for me, there is one comment I place higher than the rest: considerate. The meaning of considerate is showing careful thought and careful not to inconvenience or hurt others. The teenager, by nature, struggles being considerate because at that age, most young people have so many of their own concerns and problems to take the time to stop to concern themselves with the difficulties and needs of other people. So, when I recognize a teenager that is considerate, I take notice because it is almost unexpected. Not undesirable, but unexpected. Consideration isn't always a quality that every adult possesses either. However, the world would be a significantly better place if many more adults were considerate. The modern-day messes that are the African continent and the Middle East region are largely the result of European leaders not being considerate of the people and societal structures existing in the colonies they dominated. Me first or us first attitudes, like what the colonial rulers demonstrated, caused harm to others and made the world overall a worse off place. Similarly, in our own lives, focusing only on our own problems and desires means that we can't use our gifts and skills to make someone else's life a little bit better, which could have made all the difference in the world for that person.
Wow, so learning about Africa's partitioning is really important for me to understand. I'm glad I learned it today.
Right you are. Are you ready for some review questions?
Yep. Why did the Europeans first take an interest in Africa's continent? In the scramble for Africa, what did the European countries ignore as they created new political boundaries? The political cartoon shows European officials eating a cake of Africa. The artist in this cartoon is most likely trying to depict which of the historical events? The modern-day political boundaries, civil wars, and conflict found in Africa can often be traced back to Europeans viewed Africa's culture as
Thank you, Isabel, for co-hosting with me today. I hope the rest of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the partitioning of Africa. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff, but do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now!